My parents threw me out of the house at 18, laughing as I stood in the rain clutching the only belongings I had left, convinced I'd fail without them. "You're nothing without us?" my mother sneered, arms crossed in bitter triumph, while my father quietly closed the door, sealing my fate. I never imagined that just 7 years later, they'd be desperately begging me for help, their calls flooding my phone, their pride reduced to pleading voicemails I couldn't ignore. But let's rewind first, back to that miserable night when it all began. My name is Lucas, and growing up, my life was scripted long before I ever had a say in it. My parents weren't wealthy, but they always acted like we were richer than reality allowed. My father, a mid-level manager at a local insurance company, wore his pressed shirts and ties like badges of honor. My mother, a secretary at a doctor's office, always dressed sharply, obsessively cleaning the house and trimming rose bushes to perfection, as if our neat, tidy facade could mask the dysfunction beneath. To my parents, appearances were everything, and I was just another reflection of their carefully curated lives. I hated it. Not them, not completely, but the suffocating pressure, their endless expectations, and the predetermined future they'd mapped out for me felt like chains around my neck. Go to the state university, get a prestigious degree, marry someone respectable from the neighborhood, have kids, climb some imaginary corporate ladder. All of it pre-decided, packaged neatly without my input. I tried at first. I forced myself to study, to focus in class, but it felt like running uphill through mud. It wasn't laziness. I simply couldn't find meaning in memorizing dates or formulas I knew I'd never use. My teachers wrote notes home, warning that my potential was slipping, and dinner quickly became an interrogation room every night. My only escape was filmmaking. At 16, I'd saved every penny from my part-time grocery store job to buy a second-hand camera. I stayed up late filming short clips in my garage, editing videos until my eyes blurred. It became my refuge, the one place where I felt free from my parents' judgment. But when I finally gathered the courage to tell them I wanted to pursue film instead of college, the reaction was worse than I ever anticipated. My father's voice echoed through the kitchen as he slammed his fist down, silverware rattling with his rage, demanding to know how I could throw away every advantage they'd ever given me. My mother sat silent, tears welling, her disappointment sharper than any scream could have been. The weeks afterward were tense and silent, like the calm before a storm. They filled out applications for universities I didn't want to attend, ignoring every attempt I made to show them film programs or apprenticeships. Then came the evening that changed everything. I'd secretly applied and gotten into a prestigious film apprenticeship, complete with a partial scholarship based on videos I'd painstakingly created late at night. Naively, I thought presenting this news at dinner might finally convince my parents I'd found my path. Instead, it detonated like a grenade in our family dynamic. My mother burst into tears, accusing me of ruining their dreams, while my father coldly told me I was throwing my future away, disgracing the family name. When I stood my ground, he gave me an ultimatum, icy and final. "If you walk out that door, you're nothing without us. You won't last a month." My mother stood beside him, eyes narrowed in cold triumph, absolutely certain I'd come crawling back. Something snapped inside me then. Not in rage, but in stubborn resolve. They'd always controlled me through fear and guilt, but this time, I refused to back down. Without another word, I marched upstairs and grabbed the duffel bag I'd hidden under my bed for weeks, packed with clothes, my laptop, and the precious savings I'd hidden away. Exactly $980. Grabbing my documents, birth certificate, ID, all carefully stored in preparation for this moment, I returned downstairs. My parents stood frozen, disbelief washing over their faces as I stepped toward the door. My mother finally broke the silence, warning I'd regret this decision. My father merely opened the door without another word, his eyes refusing to meet mine. As I stepped outside, the heavy door closed behind me, echoing like a final verdict. I stood numb on our immaculate front lawn, rain soaking through my clothes, reality sinking in fast. I'd gone from sheltered teenager to homeless kid in mere minutes. A wave of panic surged, but beneath it was determination. a fiery determination not just to survive, but to prove them wrong. With trembling hands, I called my best friend Ethan, whose parents had always treated me with kindness. They took me in without hesitation, giving me shelter for those first chaotic nights. But as I lay awake on their spare couch, staring at the ceiling, panic surged through my chest. My entire life had changed overnight. I was now responsible for myself completely: bills, food, survival. The gravity of homelessness, abandonment, hit me hard. In school, the whispers felt deafening. Classmates stared, pity mixing with curiosity, while teachers avoided my gaze. The loneliness was overwhelming. I'd slip into empty classrooms just to cry unnoticed, haunted by images of my parents' rejection and my mother's smug confidence that I'd fail. Yet beneath it all burned something more powerful: determination. I threw myself into the apprenticeship, balancing late nights editing videos for extra income and endless shifts stocking shelves. The exhaustion was brutal, but the memory of my father's words, "You're nothing without us," fueled every step forward. Each paycheck, each small achievement, felt like an act of rebellion, evidence that maybe, just maybe, I could survive beyond the shadow they'd cast over my life. I didn't know it then, lying sleepless and scared on Ethan's couch, but my parents were wrong. Not just about my failure, but about everything they thought defined success. And soon enough, the tables would turn in ways none of us could ever predict. I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the kitchen, the smell of coffee drifting through the small apartment. For a moment, I forgot where I was, my brain still wired to expect my old room, my neatly folded blankets, my mother's voice calling me downstairs for breakfast. But then reality hit. I was on a couch that wasn't mine, in a home that wasn't mine, because my parents had thrown me out like I was nothing. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, my chest tight with the weight of everything that had happened. Ethan's mom greeted me with a warm smile, handing me a plate of toast and eggs, her kindness almost unbearable. I muttered a thank you, barely managing to swallow past the lump in my throat. It had been 3 days since I left home, and I was still running on pure adrenaline, refusing to let myself process the full impact of my situation. But deep down, the panic was building, creeping into every thought. I had no stable income, no real home, no idea how to survive on my own. And the worst part? My parents hadn't called. Not once. They were really going to let me fail. Before we continue the story, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop the flag of your country in the comments below. Now let's get back to it. I knew I couldn't stay on Ethan's couch forever. His parents were kind, but they had their own struggles, their own bills to pay. So I spent every spare moment looking for a place to stay, scrolling through cheap rentals, but everything was too expensive. My savings, just under $1,000, felt like a fortune before I left home. Now it felt like a ticking time bomb, every dollar spent pushing me closer to disaster. I picked up extra shifts at the grocery store, working late nights stocking shelves, and even asked my manager if there were any full-time positions available. He laughed, clapping me on the back. "Kid, full-time means benefits. You think they're giving that to an 18-year-old? Reality hit like a slap. The world wasn't built for people like me, kids with nowhere to go, kids without a safety net. At school, things were unbearable. Whispers followed me in the hallways. People stared at me like I was some kind of tragic story playing out in real time. Some offered fake sympathy, their words laced with morbid curiosity. Others just avoided me altogether. But the worst part was the teachers. They knew. They could see the exhaustion in my face, the way my clothes were wrinkled from sleeping on a couch, the way I flinched every time someone asked about college. But they didn't ask, didn't step in. Maybe they thought I deserved it. Maybe they believed, like my parents, that I was throwing my life away. One afternoon, while mindlessly scrolling through rental listings I couldn't afford, I found something. A shared apartment. It was cheap, ridiculously cheap, which meant it was probably a dump. But I didn't care. I met with the landlord the next day, a greasy-looking guy who barely glanced at me before shoving the lease forward. "First and last month's rent up front," he grunted. I hesitated. That was nearly all my savings. But I didn't have a choice. I signed my name, handed over the cash, and just like that, I had a place of my own. Well, 1/3 of a place. My new roommates were strangers. One guy named Troy who worked nights, and another guy, Owen, who I quickly realized was either a dealer or the world's worst hoarder. The place was a disaster. The walls were stained, the kitchen smelled like something had died in the sink, and the bathroom had exactly 2 working lights, one of which flickered ominously. But it was mine, or at least it was a start. Living on my own was harder than I expected. I rationed my food, stretching a single bag of rice and a carton of eggs across multiple meals. Laundry became a luxury, quarters too precious to waste when I needed them for bus fare. I walked whenever I could, rain or shine, saving every dollar. At night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the apartment. Troy coming home at 3 a.m., Owen yelling at someone over the phone, the occasional scurry of something in the walls. And every night, I fought the same creeping thought. Was this what my parents wanted? Were they sitting at home, smug, waiting for me to give up and crawl back? The thought made me sick. I refused to let them be right. A few weeks in, I got a second job washing dishes at a diner. It was brutal, hot, greasy work that left my hands raw, but it meant an extra paycheck, a little more breathing room. The exhaustion was relentless, but I didn't stop, couldn't. And then, one night, something happened that changed everything. At the hardware store where I still worked part-time, a man came in looking for specific supplies, drill bits, wood screws, mounting brackets. He looked frustrated, muttering under his breath about how none of the employees knew what they were talking about. I stepped in, not just helping him find what he needed, but explaining exactly how to install them, even sketching out a diagram on the back of his receipt. He paused, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You ever done renovation work?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, but I learn fast." He smirked. "I can tell." His name was Greg, and he ran his own contracting business. He didn't offer me a job on the spot, but he took my number, told me he might need an extra set of hands on a project. I didn't think much of it. People say things all the time. But 3 days later, my phone rang. Greg needed help on a kitchen remodel. It wasn't glamorous, and it paid barely above minimum wage, but it was real work. Work that actually meant something. The first day on the job, I felt like a fraud. I didn't belong here, surrounded by guys who had years of experience, who knew exactly what they were doing. But Greg was patient. He taught me how to measure twice, cut once, how to handle a power drill properly, how to problem solve when things didn't go according to plan. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like I was actually learning something useful, something that mattered. 3 months passed in a blur of long shifts, late-night editing for my film apprenticeship, and sheer, stubborn willpower. My body ached, my savings account barely grew, but I was surviving. More than that, I was proving them wrong. My parents still texted occasionally, their messages always the same. "When you're ready to come home and be reasonable, let us know." I never responded, because for the first time in my life I wasn't living for them. I was living for me. But just when I thought I had things under control, my parents found out about my job, and that's when everything changed. My phone buzzed just as I finished securing the last cabinet handle in a newly remodeled kitchen. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and glanced at the screen. It was a text from my mother. At first, I thought it was another one of her passive-aggressive attempts to lure me back home. But then I saw the words that made my stomach tighten. "We need to talk. It's important." I ignored it. For months, I had learned to block out their messages, their guilt-tripping attempts to break me down. They never called to ask if I was okay. Never once did they acknowledge the struggle I went through just to survive. Every message was a variation of the same theme. I was making a mistake. They were still willing to forgive me if I came back and followed their plan. I had no interest in playing along. But later that night, as I sat in my tiny apartment eating a dinner of microwaved ramen and leftover diner fries, curiosity got the best of me. I opened my phone and scrolled through my mother's text again. The wording was different this time, less demanding, more desperate. Against my better judgment, I called her. She picked up on the first ring. Lucas, she breathed, as if she hadn't heard my voice in years. I didn't say anything. Your father, he lost his job. They let him go last week. Things have been hard. Her voice wavered, but I couldn't tell if it was real emotion or just another performance. I let the silence stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable. And, I finally asked. She hesitated. We might need a little help, just for a while. You know how tough the economy is right now. There it was. The moment I had never imagined. My parents, the same people who threw me out without a second thought, now coming to me for help. The irony was suffocating. I should have felt vindicated. I should have reveled in the fact that their arrogance had finally caught up to them. But all I felt was tired. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You're asking me for money? It's not like that, she rushed to say. We're just in a difficult spot. Your father gave everything to that company, and they repaid him by cutting his position. We thought, she paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. We thought maybe you'd want to help your family in times of need. I almost laughed. Family. A word they only remembered when it was convenient for them. Funny, I said, leaning back in my chair. Because when I was struggling, when I had nowhere to go, when I was living off diner scraps and wondering if I'd even make it to the next month, you didn't seem all that concerned about family then. Lucas, please, she whispered, and for the first time, I heard something genuine in her voice. Not guilt, not control, just fear. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up before she could say anything else. The next few days were a blur. I went to work, edited videos late into the night, and tried to push the conversation with my mother to the back of my mind. But it was impossible to ignore. Their downfall was unfolding exactly the way I once dreamed it would. Yet instead of feeling triumphant, I felt conflicted. Then the Facebook post happened. I woke up to my phone vibrating with notifications. A dozen messages from old family friends, distant relatives, even some people I barely remembered from high school. You're such a good son. Family is everything. Your parents are lucky to have you. Confused, I scrolled through my feed and found the source of the chaos. My mother's post. She had written a long, dramatic message about how my father had lost his job, about how life throws unexpected challenges at even the best of us, and how they were so blessed to have a son who was supporting his family during these hard times. I stared at the words, my stomach twisting in anger. I hadn't given them a cent. They were using me, again, manipulating me into a role I never agreed to play. They had painted me as the dutiful son, making it impossible for me to refuse without looking like a monster. I was fuming, but I didn't react. Not yet. Instead, I waited. A week later, they invited me over for dinner. The first invitation in nearly 5 years. I knew exactly what it was about. They weren't interested in reconnecting. They wanted money. But I went anyway, not because I was going to help them, but because I needed to see them face to face. I needed closure. When I walked into my childhood home, everything felt smaller. The furniture was the same, but there was a layer of dust settling in the corners. My mother greeted me with forced warmth, my father with an awkward nod. They made small talk, pretending everything was normal, but I could feel the tension buzzing beneath the surface. It wasn't until after dinner that my father finally spoke. Lucas, I know we've had our differences, but your mother and we could use some support right now, just until we get back on our feet. I set down my glass. Define support. He cleared his throat. We're behind on the mortgage. Just a little. We need some help covering expenses. Maybe a loan. Family helps each other, right? I studied him, this man who once told me I'd be nothing without him. Now, he was the one looking at me for salvation. I leaned forward, my voice steady. You told me I was nothing without you, that I wouldn't last a month on my own, that I'd come crawling back. But here we are, 5 years later, and I'm doing just fine. And you? You need me now. Neither of them spoke. I exhaled sharply. I'm not giving you money. My mother flinched as if I had slapped her. Lucas, please. You don't understand how hard it is. No, I interrupted. You don't understand. I fought for every single thing I have. I worked 2 jobs while finishing my apprenticeship. I lived in a cockroach-infested apartment because I had no other choice. And the entire time, you sat in this house waiting for me to fail. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I pushed back my chair and stood up. I'm done being manipulated. I'm done being guilt-tripped. If you two want to fix your lives, do it without me. Because I don't owe you anything. I turned and walked toward the door. My mother called my name, but I didn't stop. My father didn't say a word. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The weight I had carried for years, the need to prove myself to them, the anger, the resentment, finally started to lift. I got into my car, turned my phone off, and drove away, leaving them behind in the house they could no longer afford. But as much as I wanted to believe that was the end, I knew it wasn't. Because people like them, they never let go that easily. I thought walking away from my parents that night would be the end of it. That I'd finally closed the chapter of my life where their opinions, their manipulations, their expectations had any power over me. But life has a way of bringing things full circle, and as much as I wanted to believe I was done with them, the universe had other plans. A month after I turned them down, I got another message from my mother. No pleasantries this time, no fake warmth. Just one sentence. We lost the house. For a moment I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just a quiet confirmation of something I'd seen coming from a mile away. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, convinced that their way was the only way. And now, they were facing the consequences of their own arrogance. Part of me expected them to vanish from my life completely after that, but I underestimated just how deeply their pride ran. Instead of admitting defeat, they doubled down. Word spread through distant relatives that my parents were telling everyone they had given me everything, that I had abandoned them in their time of need. It was laughable, really. The same people who had thrown me out at 18, sure I would fail, now painting me as the villain in their tragic little narrative. I ignored it. I had better things to focus on. My work was taking off. The film projects I'd been quietly building over the years were finally gaining traction. I had started taking on bigger contracts, networking with people who saw my talent rather than my past. Every day I built something real, something that was mine. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I usually let those go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to pick up. Lucas. The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar yet familiar. It's Dad. I said nothing, waiting. There was a long pause before he exhaled sharply. I took a job. That caught me off guard. My father, the man who spent his entire life obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder, had finally stepped down from his pedestal. It's at a warehouse, he continued, voice tight. Loading shipments. Not exactly what I thought I'd be doing at my age. But another sigh. I guess life doesn't care much about what we expect, does it? For the first time in years, he sounded human. Not the cold, controlling man I had grown up fearing, but just a person. A flawed, humbled person. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Guess not, I muttered. Another pause. Then, quietly, your mom and we've been seeing a counselor. I sat up a little straighter. That was new. She says we have a lot to work through, he admitted, almost bitterly. Stuff we should have worked through years ago. I let that sink in. This wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was something. A crack in the wall they had built for so long. So why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Another pause. Then, the quietest words I'd ever heard from him. Because I thought you should know. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. We weren't going to be the kind of family that suddenly made up for lost time. Too much had happened. Too many scars still fresh. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. Not a clean slate, but a slow rebuilding. I didn't offer them money. I didn't rush to fix their problems. Instead, I simply said, good, and hung up. Because the greatest revenge isn't proving someone wrong with anger. It's proving them wrong by thriving. by showing them, without a doubt, that you never needed their approval to be great. And as I sat in my office, surrounded by the life I had built on my own, I realized something important. My parents had always believed that success meant control, that love was conditional, that family was something you had to obey, rather than something you chose. But I had learned the truth. Success wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about freedom. Love wasn't about conditions. It was about the people who stood by you, even when you had nothing. And family? Family was the people who showed up, not the ones who expected something in return. So to anyone out there struggling, anyone who has been told they're nothing without someone else, remember this: you are enough. You are capable. And the best revenge is living so well that they have no choice but to watch. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about my story? If you enjoyed it, drop a 2 in the comments. If you didn't, drop a 7, I can take it. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. HeartVibes. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share more with you. See you in the next one.